She poured dirty water on him in the middle of a ballroom full of people. It fell slow in the lights, brown and heavy, splattering across his shirt, sliding down his trousers, showering the polished marble with a sullen, embarrassed hiss. Cameras went up like metal flowers. Guests swallowed. The clink of silverware stopped as if someone had struck a bell. For a long second there was nothing but the sound of water and the small, private sound of a man breathing steady in the face of sudden shame. That moment hung in the air, but it did not tell the whole story. It was the storm, not the weather report. On a different morning, one that felt ordinary, safe, the kind of domestic smallness couples learn to live within, Nathan Bennett made himself coffee in a chipped mug, tied his shoes, and folded his newspaper the way his father used to. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the roast leftover from last night. A plant by the window had been coaxed back to life after a nearly fatal neglect. Its new leaves were the color of thrift and rescue. Camille Carter Bennett was at the bedroom mirror pretending not to listen. She dressed as if for a stage, a blouse pressed tight at the shoulders, a skirt that said presentation, hair picked into a careful wave. Her wedding ring was there when she got ready in private. When she walked out the door, she slid a plastic band over the ring finger and tucked the metal out of sight. The motion was practiced, one more small erasure of the life she had quietly married. "You're coming to the gala tonight?" Camille asked over her shoulder without turning. The question had the tone of a test she already knew how she would grade. Nathan set his mug down and flattened the newspaper with the heel of his hand. He looked like a man who'd been assembled to avert attention. Plain sweater, unbranded watch, sneakers that had seen better winters. His hair was still damp from a quick, no-frills shower. The apartment looked lived in a way that refused to apologize. A stack of library books, a child-sized scarf in a donation bag, a bulletin board with a few postcards flagged. "I said I might," he answered. He said it precisely, like a man measuring the distance between what he wanted and what she expected of him. Camille smiled with something that was not tenderness. "Might? Nathan, it's the company's biggest night. Everybody who is anybody will be there. Mark's bringing the family. Ethan's mom is driving up from the plant. I told them I'd be there with you." Her voice contained the word "you" like an accusation. Nathan felt it land in the same place in his chest it always had, behind the sternum, small and assured. He could have been offended, but reserve had become a kind of armor, quiet, reliable, and oddly fierce. "If you want me there, I'll go," he said. "No need to make it a fight." Everything about him, practiced over years of small choices, suggested that he preferred to step out of storms rather than invent them. Camille turned then, finally. Her eyes were cool and decisive. "You don't fit in at those things, Nathan. They don't get you. I told Mark I'd come with someone presentable." She let the unsaid hover, presentable enough to keep the family, the office, the gossip that fed her like a secondary breath. He had noticed, in the months since the wedding, how carefully she navigated among the people who made their living at Bennett Dynamics, how she cataloged every arrangement, every seat at every table, and adjusted accordingly. She had a soft voice for her father, a brisk laugh for coworkers, and a private contempt she saved for the life she had chosen that didn't glitter. It stung because it made their small apartment feel like a rehearsal stage for someone else's show. "I don't want to be a problem," Nathan said. "If your family wants you there, go. I'll stay home." Her impatience was a low, learned thing. "No, this year matters. The press, the donors. It sets the tone for the new quarter. Don't make—" She paused, and the pause was an instruction. He could be an accessory to her ambitions, visible and unremarkable, or he could be the excuse that cost her hard-earned traction. He saw the calculation in her face and folded it into the quiet ledger he kept of all the ways a person could be loved and dismissed. "All right," he said. "I'll come." She kissed him on the cheek as if sealing a contract. "Good. Be ready by 7. She clipped on a locket that had once been his grandmother's, moved like a talisman, then slipped out into the light and down the hallway wearing shoes that made a sure sound. As the door clicked, Nathan watched the sudden shadow her leaving made on the floor. He folded the newspaper again. There were more things he could have said, small truths, large pleadings, but he had learned early in their marriage how little effect words had on the kind of person who rearranged her life like furniture and expected the rest of the room to follow. He went to the window and watched her walk to the car with her father and brother, Mark carrying the family pride like a folded flag, Ethan joking about nothing to keep up the cheer. This is the beginning of what looks like a disparity. Camille's life is large and loud, Nathan's life deliberately small. He lets things be. There was kindness in it, and a strategy. The world rarely checks the left-hand pocket to see what a man might be tugging out. If you were watching, you might notice the chipped mug on the counter and think, this is a life chosen. You might notice how the plant caught the morning light and know that someone tended to details in a way that didn't require applause. You might wonder, like the people who watch these stories unfold online, what would you do if someone close to you humiliated you in public? Drop your answer in the comments. Take a second to imagine it, because that question will follow them to the ballroom. At Bennett Dynamics, the day moved with the soft brutality of commerce. The headquarters was a house-sized modern thing of glass and stone set on its own deliberate lawn, a place designed to give visitors the feeling of being inside something larger than themselves. Inside, Camille wore a different face. Where she shaved off her ring in the apartment, here she wore confidence in layers. Measured smiles, a voice that moved easily in conference rooms, the kind of laugh that made male executives forget to be wary. Mark and Ethan occupied roles that made Camille look like the family's little engine. Mark, the proud foreman turned liaison for the company, Ethan, the younger one, trying to keep up. They had been waiting for her to bring the sort of social capital that a family with a daughter who married into someone presentable could provide. They had their own reasons to ride the current that swelled around Bennett Dynamics. Everyone in their orbit, quietly, benefited from proximity. Derek arrived mid-afternoon with a title and a grin that belonged in an office sitcom. He wore his charm like an overcoat. He hugged Camille in a way that was meant to be private but was practiced enough to look natural in the bright open hallway. When they crossed into a quieter conference room, their bodies tightened in the way of people who had made habitual compromises. "Don't be reckless tonight," Derek said, fingers brushing the small of her back like a code. She raised an eyebrow. "When have I ever been reckless?" "Tonight is different." He took her hand for a second that lasted, in both their minds, much longer than politeness warranted. There was a rhythm at play within the company that rewarded savvy navigation. Camille had learned it early, how to be seen, how to turn a glance into an advantage, how to make yourself indispensable by being the person who reminded others of what the company wanted to be. She could be warm in the right places and icy in others. People called it ambition in the same way others might call it air. Nathan, in the office, was another story in people's biographies. He didn't come. He didn't need to. His life at the center of their galaxy had always been more rumor than presence. Rumor is selective. It remembers the quick phrase. He prefers to keep to himself. It forgets the ledger, the trust, the property of ownership. That was the thing. What people believed and what was true had become two separate mountains. That evening, the Bennett Foundation Gala was a river of glass and sound. Chandelier light fell like a slow rain and hit the shoulders of people who had rehearsed their faces for the camera. Waiters moved like nervous planets, directing silver comets. A string trio kept the mood glossy and careful. Camille entered with Mark and Ethan like a queen arriving at court. Her hair gleamed. Ethan scuffed his shoe under the table in the sort of embarrassment that passes for loyalty. The audience bent in, because a show at a gala is a currency of its own. Nathan did not move. He let the words fall away like rain on a roof. His palms were steady in his pockets. Embarrassment is a fast, hot wind. He felt it, acknowledged it, and did not let it rearrange him. He knew how to be very still. Camille took a step forward. She held a bucket in both hands like someone holding the instrument of an important ritual. It looked, from the distance, like a harmless prop. There was a small thrill in the sound of her shoes against the stage. Her parents clapped as if on cue. "Sometimes," she said, "we outgrow those who anchor us to our past. Sometimes we have to decide who stands with us in the light and who stays behind." The grin she wore in that sentence had the pedigree of cruelty practiced as spectacle. Derek's expression was one of obtuse, eager malice, a man waiting for the punchline of an inside joke. The audience, leaning forward, gave a soft collective inhale, because humiliation is a form of entertainment they didn't even admit they liked. She tipped the bucket. Water, brown and thin from some maid's mistake, left the rim and fell in a brown arc. The chandelier slowed it into 1,000 points. It struck Nathan with the precise indignity of an animal that has just been trapped. The first sound was the smack of water on fabric. Then the room registered what had happened. Wet splatter, the skitter of a napkin dropped, a child's gasp far at a table. Cameras went up, fingers fumbled for record buttons. The string trio played on as if they could stitch the moment back into music. Someone hissed. Nathan's collar darkened as the liquid soaked into it, pulling the color down like ink. It ran down his sleeve in a thin, accusing line. People around him shifted, some with the awkwardness of measured charity, others with the gleeful snap of spectators in a play they didn't have to write. Camille stood at the edge of the stage with a look of triumph that had the brittle shape of victory. Her father clapped, his face taut with the belief he'd seen his daughter's ascent. Derek laughed out loud. A woman with bright nails snapped a photo. "You never do anything for me," Camille called down, the microphone still warm in her hand. "You never show up for us. My family deserved better. I deserved someone who looked like us." The words were barbs disguised as explanation. Nathan felt them like a heat on his skin, not from the water, but from the idea of being made small by someone who had once promised him anything but this. He wanted to speak, to tell her how wrong she was. He wanted, for a second, to be the man who made noise. Instead, he turned his face to the people caught in the current of her cruelty and walked away. The room watched him go. For all the sound, there was a hush that swallowed the space between steps. He left in a manner that made the story split. There was the man who had been humiliated and the man who chose the world in a different key. Outside, the air was cold and thin. The city felt sharp in the night. He pulled the collar of his sweater up against the chill and let the water drip from his sleeves into the gutter. He could hear the hum of the gala like an oceanada distant. His face had a smallness about it now, as if someone had tried to take the outline of a life and press it smaller with their thumb. Nathan leaned against the hood of a car and let the silence fold around him. Against the sound of his heart, he could hear flashes of their early years. The first time Camille had laughed without looking over her shoulder. The scraped knee he had bandaged when they were both still learning the map of each other's bodies. There were Polaroid moments in his memory that mattered in ways he hadn't allowed himself to measure. He thought of his father, Richard Bennett, a man who had built things and taught his son the quiet ways power could be held. No grandstanding, no need to call attention to what was already true. Richard used to say, in the private tone of men who trusted each other with the shape of their legacies, that authority lived in the trust of men and paper. Nathan had learned to carry that trust like a quiet ledger, a thing that belonged to him and not to the applause of others. That truth stretched behind Nathan like a shadow that was also an offering. The thing about public humiliations is that they can be both spectacle and instruction. People make decisions about you in the time it takes to clap. Camille had chosen to teach the room what she thought he was. They had accepted the lesson for a minute, like pupils obedient to a teacher they trusted. Nathan allowed that small story to stand for the moment it needed to. He did not storm back into the room. He did not make a scene. He watched the car doors pulse with light from the ballroom, watched people cross the walk like small constellations. He let the water on his clothes cool and the night move around him. There was no heroic roar. There was, instead, a slow collection of something else, an inventory born of a man used to counting. A woman from the gala stepped outside to give him a tissue. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thin with an awkwardness that never translates into real consolation. He took it and smiled briefly, in the way someone takes a kindness and sets it down like a coin. "I appreciate it," he said. He meant it in the way people mean small civility. He wasn't ready to let this be the ending. Inside the hall, conversations had tilted. Some whispered that the divorce was imminent, some called for security, others took out their phones and turned the moment into the slow, eruptive currency of viral shame. Derek was being quietly shepherded by a few well-placed men, his grin dampened by a gossiping curiosity. Mark hovered near Camille the way men do near pyres they cannot control. Camille's smile had the slight tremor of momentum that might be unsustainable. Nathan did not go home. He sat in his car for a while with the seat warmed from the evening, letting the echo of the gala wash through him as if it were a tide that could be observed rather than feared. He called no one. He swiped at the stain on his shirt with his fingers and thought of the ledger he kept that others did not see, the trusts, the letters, the names on the papers that sat somewhere while life did its loud pageant around them. He thought about the easy assumptions people made when they fit another's life to a small, flattering shape. People built stories because stories are how they make sense of each other. People saw him lately as a certain hull of a man who had walked in the world and chosen to step aside. He had allowed them that story for its advantages. Anonymity had its own privileges. But anonymity does not erase consequence. It simply delays the moment the truth runs up against a public spectacle. On his way back to the curb, he paused at the far end of the valet line. The gala was a performance with many scenes, and this had been one that would live in people's retellings. Nathan could return and accept the role she had written for him. He could withdraw and let the night fold into rumor, or he could do something that would remind the room that the private ledger he kept mattered in ways the world might not assume. He started the engine. The decision felt less like revenge and more like collection. Not the small, cruel joy of paying back with cruelty, but the precise, administrative closing of old accounts. He thought of the people who watched and recorded. He thought of the ones who made career decisions based on the choreography of appearances. He thought of Camille, bright and sharp, and certain she had the moral high ground. As he drove through the dark towards a place he had not named, his mind was not loud with outrage. It worked like a room being arranged, one object at a time, careful, removing clutter, placing pieces where they would be seen as they deserved. When he parked behind a service entrance at the Bennett compound, a place that breathed in a different daily rhythm from the ballroom, he felt the air change around him, like stepping from one language into another. Inside, the lights were lower. Staff moved with the soft competence of people whose job was to keep the gears turning. Nathan nodded to a security guard who recognized him without a question. Recognition is a thing that lives on the same plane as certain papers and old hands. He crossed the marble quietly and walked into an office that smelled of leather and paper and coffee mugs that had been in meetings since before Camille's father worked there. There was a cabinet with a nameplate that read Bennett Dynamics, and beneath it the foundation of a family business built over decades. Nathan went to his desk, a place he visited with some frequency, not because he needed the room, but because places like this have histories that must be kept tidy. He took off his wet sweater and hung it over a chair as if it were a prop returning to where it belonged. He opened a drawer and slid out a suit he had kept for nights like these, dark, sober, the kind that quietly announces a presence without making noise. He dressed with the economy of someone who had done this before. The buttons sat where they always did. The cufflinks, a small inherited pair his father had given him, gleamed briefly as he snapped them into place. He looked different in the mirror, not because his face had changed, but because the clothing refrained him in a vocabulary people understood. It was not a transformation of the soul, only of the signals a room reads. A car arrived at the compound's valet with a quiet carrier of people who belonged to another orbit, a small convoy of company vehicles that suggested the night's story could be interrupted. Nathan did not call for drama. He arranged for order. A discreet message to a trusted HR director, a note to a small circle of executives who would understand the necessity of immediate action. He did not shout. He wrote. He sealed. He set things in motion with that same calm measure that had kept his life from rattling apart in small crises before. When he left the building this time, he wore the suit and his face had the deliberate clarity of a man who had decided to speak in a register the world would not mistake for emptiness. He didn't drive with sirens, he returned with presence. The arrangement of a man's return is different from the clatter of theatrical comeback. He had learned, from a father who believed in the work of institutions more than the spectacle of headlines, that the last word often belongs to the ledger and the signatures that close it. The valet at the gala opened the door for him, and, for a few seconds, the room inhaled. People turned because someone who had been small in their imaginations had stepped back into frame. There are sounds that follow a man into a room, chairs stalking to attention, a hand stopping in mid-clank. Camille's face registered the new figure before realization did. For a second she looked pleased, sure she had orchestrated some necessary theatrics that cemented her status. Then the floor under her certainty shifted. But that moment belonged to what came next, and the next part of the story waited on the other side of a breath. He moved through the crowd with a steadiness that disarmed rumor. He carried with him the quiet authority of someone who could issue a decision that would ripple through careers and gossip in equal measure. People parted, not out of fear, but because the shape of him matched a room's expectation of a different kind of story. Nathan didn't raise his voice. He simply walked where actions counted more than speeches. Inside, in the warm roar of the ballroom, Camille still held the microphone as the last drops of water darkened Nathan's shirt. Her laughter had an edge to it now, a sharpness that would not long keep its fashion in the rooms where reputations are delicate as porcelain. Derek hovered behind her like a man who had expected rewards without price. Mark and Ethan stood at her shoulders as if they could lend their presence like armor. No one suspected then that the next movement would be the beginning of a ledger being checked, not by headlines alone, but by policies, by signatures, by access revoked with the clinical precision of office procedure. No one suspected, but a change had been set into motion, a small administrative cascade that would force accountability in a world that often avoided it. Outside, the cold did not care for the lives it bisected. Inside, the room waited for the next thing to happen, because it always does. The audience loves an arc. It loves the end of a scene. Nathan stood very still, his wet shirt now drying in the air, as if nature were taking pity on a human script. He watched Camille's chest move as she laughed at something Derek whispered. He thought of the plant by the window in the apartment, the chipped mug he had left on the counter, and the way a life of small, deliberate acts can be more consequential than the thunderous ones the world notices. There was much to be done. He would not storm, he would not yell. He would close accounts in the way his father had taught him, by turning the pages quietly, by placing the right signatures, by making the decisions that ripple, in the sober fashion of institutions, into immediate consequence. He stepped forward. The room watched him approach like a tide noticing a moon. He did not raise his voice, he did not brandish. He spoke with the hushed authority of someone who had decided that dignity is not passivity and that justice can sound like a clear ledger rather than a shout. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady and even. The words did not demand attention, they collected it. Camille looked up as if the world had made a mistake. Her eyes searched his face and, for a moment, read only the wetness and the supposed lack. Then incredulity registered, and the room leaned closer to see what would surface. He had no need to beg for sympathy. He had no need to perform outrage. He had only to let a room remember that there is a thing called authority and another called consequence, and sometimes the two meet where a private life and a public role intersect. He asked a question that was not loud enough to be heard in the back of the hall, but clear enough to rearrange the moment. "Who approved that?" he said.
It was a simple phrase. It was also, in the currency of the night, the opening of an account. The people around him paused because it matters who sets rules and who breaks them. The gala was, in that suspended second, a small tribunal. What happened next would test allegiances and decide careers. The auditorium hummed like a beast preparing to roar. Visitors searched for the actors who would decide the climax. Nathan's shoulders were steady. The water that had been humiliating had become the small wetness of a scene about to be rewritten. The question hung like a small bell, precise and plain. Who approved that? The microphone trembled in Camille's hand as if it had suddenly become a foreign object. Around them, the hum of conversation thinned into a line of sharp attention. Faces turned from amusement to curiosity to a kind of anticipatory discomfort. For the first time since she had mounted the stage, Camille looked as if she'd lost a script. From the back of the room, an HR director moved forward with the hesitant speed of someone who knows the floor can tilt beneath them at a whisper. Marion Cole, 40-something, efficient, the sort of person who had spent years fitting policy into the messy shape of humanity, came up the aisle carrying a slim laptop and a file. Her badge caught the overhead light in a small, honest flash. "Mr. Bennett," she called, seeing him as if for the first time through the fog of the event. "Is there—" He met her halfway with a quiet that required no flourish. "Yes," he said. "Can you confirm who had authorization for that stage action and whether a formal request was submitted?" Marion glanced toward the stage where a small knot of employees and guests clustered, their phones raised like lit stakes. She swallowed, then tapped the laptop. The screen lit up with schedules and access logs, the invisible architecture that keeps a company running and that also protects it when tempers cross boundaries. Her index finger moved, and a list unfurled. Event permits, stage crew contracts, microphone reservations, no approved stunt, no signed release authorizing public humiliation as part of the night's program. "It's not in the system," she said, the words doing the work of a verdict without drama. "There are no authorizations." Camille's laugh scraped. "It's a joke, an anecdote. Everyone does this." "It was an assault," Marion interrupted, not unkindly, but with the surety of someone trained to name things correctly. "We have policies on workplace conduct and guest safety. If it was arranged without approval, that's a breach." A murmur swelled. Derek's grin turned brittle. He took a step back as if the room's gravity had shifted under him. Mark and Ethan, nearby enough to be drawn into the orbit, exchanged a look that contained both bravado and the first flakes of panic. The guests found their phones until they could not help it, an instinct to document what their eyes had refused to deny. Nathan listened as Marion read the company policy into the bright air, not to humiliate Camille, but to remove the theatrical cover she had tried to wear. She spoke about consent, about events procedures, about the responsibilities that attach to public roles.
Each word mapped a ledger line: action, authorization, accountability. "I'd like to see the person who signed the event plan," Nathan said simply. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask for names as if his authority were a tantrum. He asked like someone opening a book and seeking the right page. Marion hesitated, then excused herself and moved toward the stage manager. In her hand, her laptop hummed like a small, impartial witness. Cameras continued to record. The string trio played an uneasy cadence in the background, as if accompaniment could smooth an accusation into something gentler. When Marion returned, the look on her face had the line of an administrator given bad news. "No approval came through," she reported. "No signed waiver, no scheduled demonstration. Mr. Bennett, there was no formal permission." A ripple of shock passed through the clustered guests. Some faces crumpled with embarrassment. Others leaned in, hungry for an ending. Camille's posture stiffened, as if someone had replaced the heels under her feet. Derek's jaw worked. Nathan held the moment in the way he'd been taught to hold ledgers, neither to gloat nor to minimize, but to let the facts land with their own weight.
"Then we'll treat it as a breach of policy," he said. "We will launch the standard response." "Mr. Bennett," Marion began, the tone of a woman who had practiced diplomacy, "we need authorization to take employment action." He reached into the inside pocket of his suit with a slow, unceremonious motion and pulled out a slim, sealed folder. It bore the company seal, and beneath it an imprint of his name, Nathan Bennett. There were signatures visible at the corner, names people knew, and names that meant authority. The folder itself had the weight of long practice, proper forms, designated approvals, and an emergency delegation clause, a modest thing, bureaucratic and stern, that recognized the possibility someone might abuse a public occasion. No one in the room had expected it. The sealed document looked much like any other administrative instrument, but its presence in his hand sent a hush that felt less like a fall and more like the recognition of a truth people had not been invited to hold. The man they'd been willing to dismiss had keys to the building the size of inked signatures and consent. "That will do," Marion said, her training making room for the reality of the paper. She opened it, scanning with a practiced eye. Then, without a flourish, she began to make calls. Quiet, deliberate, each one a soft command that set a protocol into motion. Security would be instructed to escort guests who had violated policy from the premises pending investigation. Access badges would be suspended. HR would prepare separation notices for any employee found to have been complicit in staging unauthorized acts. It was not a theatrical justice. It was administrative. It carried a clarity that left little room for improvisation.
Camille stepped forward, the microphone now a small iron in her hand. "Nathan, this is ridiculous," she said, the edges of the word cracking. "This is personal. You can't—" He held up a hand as if to file away an interruption. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about the standards we set and how we treat one another in public and private. If we let cruelty be a spectacle, we normalize it until people mistake cruelty for humor." There was a shard of something like shame in her face, but it was fleeting. "You never used to be so moralizing," she snapped. "You never used to care what anybody thought." "I care about how people are treated here," he replied. "That's my concern tonight." Marion worked with the clinical speed of an institution called to enforce its own rules. The laptop typed and the system recorded. An announcement was prepared for the stage, an apology for the disturbance, and notification that the company would not tolerate unauthorized actions that humiliated individuals or created unsafe situations. The wording was measured. It would be posted in the corporate channels, sent to partners, and entered into the minutes as a formal response. Security moved with quiet restraint. A young man in a black suit approached Derek first, offering a hand that might have been for directions rather than restraint. Derek's bravado dissolved into a series of small, useless explanations. He found himself led away, murmuring about miscommunication, about a joke taken wrong. Behind him, an executive who had been laughing now stood in a small circle, their expressions recalibrating into professional concern. Mark protested, voice loud with a father's wounded pride. "She didn't mean," he began, but Marion cut him off with corporate calm. "We'll investigate all involvement," she said. "If company members were complicit in staging a personal attack, there will be consequences." The room was quick to create narratives. Some said the action was spontaneous. Others muttered that Derek or even Mark had arranged details to bolster Camille's performance. The truth, in the end, did not matter as much as the company's need to demonstrate it would not tolerate such conduct. Nathan had made that demonstration without spectacle. That itself was the point. Camille's face changed, not into contrition, but into the shade of someone recognizing that performance had a price. She tried to speak, to frame it as a personal grievance finally articulated, the tiredness of standing always second, but her words found no shelter. Marion, following procedure, asked her to step aside while the company issued its public statement.
"Camille," Nathan said quietly, leaning in as if to remove the microphone from the clumsiness of the moment, "we're going to handle this through HR. Please stay until we can speak." Instead of compliance, a flash of anger unfurled. "You can't," she hissed. "You can't make me the villain. You made a choice," he answered.
You chose a public humiliation without authorization. We will respond accordingly. Security escorted Camille from the stage amid a soft chorus of phones and impolite whispers. She did not fight, she did not cry. She moved with the patient indignation of a person who believed the world owed her posture and would be restored to it. Derek left quietly in the company of men who talked in low voices. Mark and Ethan hovered at the edge of the narrative, their faces draining of the earlier glow. By the time the company's prepared statement was read over the speakers, an apology for the disruption, and an assurance that violations of workplace conduct would be taken seriously, cameras had widened the frame. News bites began to form. The press, who had been present for the glamour, now had the messy human thing they preferred: consequence. Backstage, Marion did the work that bureaucracies do in such moments. She initiated separation procedures where evidence supported them and suspended access where policy demanded it. Camille was placed on immediate leave pending review. Derek's employment status would be examined. Mark and Ethan's involvement would be investigated for abuse of company influence. It was not vengeance. It was an institutional resetting. As decisions were put into motion, the crowd's appetite for drama dwindled into an uneasy awareness. An event that had begun as a spectacle had been transformed into the slow, stern fold of organizational consequence. Nathan watched it unfold with a firmness that didn't need judgment on his face, only the clarity of a man who had known how to move his ledger when a page went awry. Later, in a quieter room lit by the afterglow of chandeliers, Marion handed Nathan a list, a small printed roster of actions already taken: access badges disabled, formal grievances filed, security statements logged. It was not a dramatic list. It was administrative and precise. "Thank you," he said. "Do what needs to be done." "We will," she replied. "We'll also be reaching out to partners and clients to explain the breach of policy. There are reputational considerations." He nodded. "Do it with clarity, no theatrics." She agreed. There was no applause for the decision. There was only the professional satisfaction of a crisis resolved by procedure rather than by rage. Camille, meanwhile, found herself outside the ballroom in a tight circle of people who wanted to know if she would fight. Reporters hovered like small birds hoping for grain. She held herself as if believing that posture could arrest consequence. Her father spoke loudly, then softer as the room around them shifted away. Ethan tried to pretend the evening had been a necessary spike in the wiring of their family's upward motion. It didn't take long for the rumor mill to crank into formal actions. By the morning after, internal memos had been sent. Several senior executives had convened in a small professional cluster to confirm the steps Marion had set in motion. The company expressed regret that an event intended to celebrate community had been derailed. Partners were informed in measured tones. An internal investigation was underway. Company policy would be enforced without favoritism. Derek's email accounts were suspended, his access to internal platforms revoked. A formal letter followed, stating that an investigation had revealed behavior inconsistent with company conduct and that his employment was being terminated pending a full review. Derek's professional network narrowed as colleagues distanced themselves. The casual conversations that once cushioned his ambition went quiet. Without the quick charm that had been his currency, he found himself less rewarded by the office rooms that had once been his stage. Mark and Ethan, implicated by association and by evidence of pressuring staff to support the stunt, faced human resources meetings that made no room for paternal excuses. Their ties to the company, comfortable as they had been, did not exempt them from the institution's need to keep its boundaries intact. They were removed from their positions, their access revoked, and their professional references placed on hold while the company documented the breach of conduct.
The community that had once gathered around their family regarded them with a new mix of curiosity and caution. For Camille, the fallout was swift and uncompromising. The company issued a statement that no employee, regardless of relation to active colleagues, would be allowed to use a corporate platform for personal humiliation. The board's minutes recorded breach of conduct and unauthorized action. A hulking phrase appeared in internal correspondence: immediate leave pending termination. The phrase landed on Camille's life like a small legal weight. She called Nathan late that night, a string of messages that moved from anger to pleading to the brittle politeness of someone attempting to salvage reputation. He did not call back. He read the messages with a clarity that felt less like cruelty and more like boundary. He had, that night, stepped away from spectacle and toward consequence. Once consequence had begun, the room's resumption required different measures than apologies. In the weeks that followed, friends and allies who had once flattered Camille's image found reasons to express concern at a distance. Clients who had once offered her social capital began to question the wisdom of public dissociation. Invitations dwindled. The network of favor that had supported her habits of performance retracted its reach like a tide pulling from shore. Images of the gala, of a woman on a stage with a bucket and a man walking away, spread on social feeds. In the court of public opinion, nuance rarely stands a long fight. Nathan did not broadcast his actions in the press.
He worked behind the company's formal channels and through fiduciary procedure. He summoned legal counsel, a sober, unflashy firm that drafted clean papers and arranged procedural closures, termination notices, HR investigations, and careful documented suspensions. He contracted with the board to ensure that any action taken would withstand scrutiny. He believed, as his father had taught him, that the work of righting a wrong is best done with clear signatures, not with fireworks. He also took the step he knew he must take for himself. The next morning, a courier arrived at the modest apartment that had been part of his life. It was a neat envelope, all business. A notice of intent to file for divorce, folded with the care of a man who preferred to set things in order rather than to make noise. There was no showmanship in the act. The papers were sterile and exact. The document cited irreconcilable differences in the plain, procedural language that divorces often wear. Camille saw the courier with a fury that did not translate into anything other than stunned vulnerability. She called him, her voice a mix of fury and pleading. "Nathan, you can't." He listened for a minute to the sound of a woman who had just discovered the limits of social grace, then said, "Camille, this isn't about punishment. It's about boundaries. I cannot build a life where public humiliation is a tool. I won't be part of a narrative that treats people as props." "You're overreacting," she spat. "You're cruel." "I won't play cruel to someone else's ambition," he replied. "That was the choice you made." The divorce moved forward without spectacle. There were meetings with lawyers, of course, procedures, signed forms, meetings that arranged property and separation. The trust that preserved corporate ownership, an instrument Nathan had been connected to through family arrangements long before Camille's arrival, meant that much of the company's assets and control were sequestered from marital distribution. That fact was not used as a weapon publicly. It was a structural reality that prevented Camille from claiming the company outright. The trust's terms, as he had long known, kept company control within the family's designated governance structure. In plain terms, it made a wide transfer of corporate ownership through divorce unworkable. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown. There was only paperwork that filed and closed in predictable, dry motions. Where public spectacle might want a judge to pound a gavel, the truth was that institutions move differently. Their corrections are executed in signatures, in waivers, and in quiet, sealed envelopes. Nathan's decision to proceed was not a vindictive swan song. It was a closure that aligned his private life with his public responsibilities. Months slipped by with a sober efficiency. Camille's name thinned from social calendars. Her father and brother attempted to rebuild a footing that had once seemed secure, their ties to the company frayed. Mark found that the networks that once smiled upon him tightened and then narrowed. Ethan took jobs that paid, but the access to cushioned rooms had gone.
Derek, now out of a job, found offers drying up as clients learned to avoid association with scandal. There were costs all around. Nathan watched some of them with an unadorned grief, not for the tactical successes he had accomplished, but for the unraveling of a family he had once been part of. He had not wanted to strip parents of jobs or to see a brother stumble. He had wanted only to end the practice that used public platforms for private cruelty. But consequence, when it finds purchase, has its own momentum. He understood that his calm had set in motion things he could not reverse with good intentions. Camille's downfall was not the cinematic collapse she might have imagined in her worst nightmares. It was quieter and erosion. She rented a smaller place once the leaves on her invitations stopped turning. The phone calls she used to collect for validation became fewer. Some nights she sat in an apartment whose lighting failed to flatter and wondered if performance had been everything she'd ever been taught to be. There was no dramatic conversion on screen. There was only a person who had to reckon with an absence of easement from the world. At the company's annual meeting months later, the official reports spoke in measured tones. A review of conduct, revised policies to prevent misuse of corporate stages, new training on ethical use of company platforms, and a short note about the need for compassion in public dealings. No proclamation was made to herald Nathan's role. The company preferred that its repairs be seen as structural and not the product of a singular act. Nathan attended the meeting with the same unflashy presence he'd always preferred. He listened to a world repairing itself in policy and small changes. In the murmur of the months, the public grew weary of the hashtag and moved on to new spectacles. Social memory is short, but the people personally involved felt the sharpness of consequence in ways that mattered. Derek found new work, but with a much diminished compass of opportunity. Mark and Ethan patched their lives with quieter jobs and less room for imaginative social climbing. Camille sometimes attended events in the hope that visibility might re-knit what she'd severed, but invitations were rarely extended. The circle of approval had, in practical terms, tightened. Nathan's life returned, as much as it could, to a quieter cadence. He tended to his plant and his chipped mug, to small routines that had the virtue of truth. He kept some distance from the gala world's pageantry. He did not gloat. He did not draw arrows with his success.
He recognized the cost of what had happened, both the harm he'd prevented and the damage that followed, and carried both with the exacting steadiness of a man who had been taught to measure things by their weight on a ledger. On a late afternoon, months after the gala, he stood by the window of the apartment and watched a small green shoot push up through the soil of a pot he'd almost forgotten about. The plant, the one he'd coaxed back to life, flushed with new leaves. It was a small, private thing, but to him it felt like a clean accounting, life tended, not broadcast. The city beyond the glass kept moving in its indifferent way. Camille's image, however diminished, sometimes flashed across news feeds in the form of a human interest piece, an interview about recovery, about mistakes and second chances. She refused to speak at first, and then, later, offered a short apology that some accepted and others found insufficient. She tried, occasionally, to reach out to friends, to patch diplomacies. Those calls were rarely returned. If she felt remorse, it was kept private. The public record preferred the clear arc of consequence. The question of mercy lingered in the margins. Some argued that Camille should have been forgiven publicly, that people make mistakes, and that careers can be rebuilt. Others felt that she had wielded the corporate platform to cause harm, and thus should bear the consequences. Nathan did not answer for the public forum. He had decided the company's line must be clear. The standards stood. The personal arc of forgiveness, or not, was not his to grant in public. In private, he could choose how to hold his own heart. Years later, when asked once by a colleague, someone who had watched the gala unfold from a different orbit, how he had found the composure to act without spectacle, he answered not with triumph, but with a kind of soft certainty. "Authority matters," he said, "but so does restraint. They are different muscles. One is for making decisions that stick. The other is for carrying what those decisions do to people's lives." He did not relish the collapse he'd overseen. He had not advertised it.
Instead, he had steered a company back to its own guardrails, made sure the ledger balanced, and then retreated to the small, honest routines he preferred. The epilogue for him was not a public vindication so much as the settling of accounts and the clear, sober shape of a life that refused to be diminished again. Camille, diminished though she had become in the eyes of her world, sometimes wandered through the lower tiers of social venues, where her name meant less and meaning could be found in smaller interactions. A charity asked her to volunteer. She went, humbly, to remind herself that service could be separate from spectacle. The world, predictably, remained mixed in its reception. Some offered second chances. Others catalogued the limits of mercy in public life.
In the end, what mattered to the people who had been in that room was not the viral clip that had made a moment of private cruelty public. It was the slow admin of consequence and the quiet dignity of the man who chose to act without turning his suffering into theater. The lesson was not that punishment was the point, but that institutions must guard the boundaries where intimacy and authority intersect. Nathan left the city one morning with a small suitcase, the plant's leaves still bright on the windowsill, the chipped mug empty on the counter. He had made his choices with a clarity that felt like a ledger properly balanced, actions taken, consequences delivered, a separation that matched the breach that had once been inflicted. Behind him, the gala's aftermath continued to ripple in ways both small and lasting. Camille stayed, in a smaller apartment with dimmer lights, learning to stand without applause. There was no cinematic redemption, no viral repentance with millions of likes. There was a quieter learning, that cruelty has consequences, that public humiliation scars both the humiliated and the humiliator in ways that money and influence cannot always repair. The last image is simple: Nathan walking away along a tree-lined street, the morning breaking soft and indifferent. He did not look back. He carried with him the small things he valued, the plant he had resurrected, a few books, the knowledge that dignity is not the same as invisibility. It had been a hard evening to survive, and he had survived it, without spectacle, by making sure that authority and accountability met where they needed to. If this story left you wondering what you would have done in Nathan's place, tell us in the comments. Would you have returned to the room or walked away? If you found this story compelling, like the video and subscribe for more stories that dig into the choices people make when their private lives collide with public consequence. Do you think Camille deserved no second chance? Tell us why below.